Okay, thank you very much. I realize a lot of you are tired, and I'm not. I had a little walk around town, but I also want to address some serious issues with you, and it's actually quite a bit. So I hope I can keep you alive a little bit. So I'm going to talk about crisis in the world economy. And we've talked quite a bit about things. I'm going to talk a bit about financial crisis. I'm going to talk a bit about climate crisis. I'm going to talk about scarcity of natural resources, shortage of oil, of gas, and how that changes geopolitical kind of situation. I'm going to talk about food crisis. And most of all, I hope we will have a little bit of a debate about perhaps what I may call, and also listening to the last speaker, what I would call actually, what I would dare to call, even though I'm an economist, what I would call a value crisis. Are we really having the right values in society, and are we installing the right type of values in our young people? The last thing is going to be a bit of a mouthful, but that's really what I'm going to try to do. So that's the overview I just talked about. Maybe it helps to start with the global financial crisis. So really, that's something which is hitting many countries. It's hitting, you mentioned, it's Hungary, it's hit much of the developing world, so parts of Europe. But there's no doubt about it that most of that crisis was really kind of had its origins both in the United States and I think the United Kingdom mostly. Later on, those kind of values, those bad values as I call them, moved over to Europe, and they were in the slipstream of that. But most of it was there. So a lot of it to do was, what you do is you basically put things in boxes. Here you have some risks or some equity or some kind of financial claims, and we know quite clearly who we are. We used to look people in the eyes. So I look you in the eyes and I said, do I trust you or not? But then after a while we had to make things automatic. So then I would buy things, claims on you. I would give you money, you promised to pay me back. But I don't know who the guy is. I mean, I don't know, it's just a name somewhere. And then what they did, and then they did with the young lady there as well. And I could look in your eyes, and then I could trust you. We have a bit of a chat. I knew your brother, I knew your sister, I knew your husband. And I think, well, it's probably all right, and they've got a shop somewhere in their family, I can always get it there. But then we stopped doing that. Because then I remember George Bush at one point saying that in America you have all these people who were on blacklists, very poor people, and were not, couldn't get credit cards, couldn't get credit. And he said suddenly to Fannie Mae and all the others, give them mortgages, give them loans to buy houses. Because in the slipstream of Mrs. Thatcher, which he was still old enough to remember, the more people buy their own house, the more likely they're going to vote Republican. And so that's what happened there, that credit standards started reducing. People didn't care anymore. And then all these clever guys came in, people like me. I'm originally a mathematician. So a lot of the mathematicians now, they don't do maths, which is a great subject, but they go into something called financial risk management. So they do things like options, derivatives, warrants, and these are very mathematical models with stochastic differential equations, stochastic calculus, and most people don't have a clue what it's all about. So what they do is then they take their shares and they take all those shares and they package them together and they put them in put a big ribbon around it, and then they sell that to another entity, another bank. And then the bank said, well, this is great fun, we can do that as well. So then they take a lot of those risks and they say, well, let's be a bit more careful. Let's take out all the good risk and let's put a little ribbon around all the bad risks, because we know, but the person we're selling to, they don't know. And they say, well, tell you what, let's sell them to our Hungarian friends, pension funds. So let's sell them to our Dutch pension funds or our British pension funds or anybody. And then suddenly, and then these pension funds were all, I mean, you explained it very well, there's this capitalism thing in the 90s happened all throughout Europe, not just in your countries, of course, most spectacularly in the Eastern European countries. But what happened was that many of those countries were forcing their pension funds to be not so boring anymore. So what were they doing? Bankers used to be quite a boring crowd. So if you were a young lady, you wouldn't want to be seen with a banker. But you say, well, you'd kind of be bored before you even start talking with them. And now everybody wants to have a banker as a boyfriend because they buy these big champagne bottles for 2,000 euros, all these obscene kind of expenditures. They are very rich. They buy houses for 2 or 3 million. They don't read the newspapers, and they're usually quite good at maths, but they just make you a lot of money. And then so they were forced, our old-fashioned institutions like pension funds, to no longer invest in safety, but to put their money into risky things, because everybody became greedy. We should get higher rates of return. So that happened throughout the world. Started in America and the UK, then went over to the rest of Europe. And boring countries like France never had an exciting financial institution. They started doing it as well. And Hungary, so everybody wanted to get rich quickly. And of course, these bad risks, sorry to say that you're of course not a bad risk, but these people were kind of these bad cherries, which were putting ribbons around and being sold. They were, of course, risky, so they could offer them to pay a higher rate of interest. So these guys said, great, it's just, these are all the elements of a bubble, and it went on and on and on. But of course, bubbles have to break, because at some point, the truth has to come out. Then the whole thing collapses, and then the whole world economy goes to the dogs, and that's really what's been going on. It's been partially made possible by, as we talked before, about very unbalanced geopolitical conditions. I already said that if America or in England were an autarkic economy, if they were not a part of the world economy, they could never live so much beyond their means. They've been living in a much richer way than they can really afford. Here in Germany, it's the opposite. So Germany came out reasonably well. The economy got a hit, but it was of an intrinsic badness, but it was because there was a hit in world trade. And so they got this knock-on effect. But for Germany, really, it's quite interesting that people are quite frugal. There's this Protestant spirit, perhaps. So they save. So they produce more than they consume. So large parts of America are owned by Germans. This poorest country in the world, China, has been producing more than it consumes. So it's been exporting things to America because they all want to wear these cheap Chinese clothes and they want to have all these cheap Chinese technological equipment. And the saving is true for Britain, so they all have to have 5 televisions, a television in every room and things like that. And with all that extra cash that China has, it has to be, that's just some accounting identity, it has to go somewhere. So that had to go back to the States to buy up assets. So these were these subprime mortgages, or they were other kind of American government bonds. So we had this kind of almost obscene kind of conditions that normally any economist would say, well, capital flows, or at least it should flow from rich countries to poor countries. Because in poor countries, let's not forget it, the biggest opportunities for profitable investments are in places like China and India, and indeed in Eastern Europe, like the Hungaries, the Czech Republic and Poland. But actually, not that much capital was flowing there. That's the big failure of the international capitalist system. At the same time, we see that there are 2 books which you should know of, and I will just not do too many books, otherwise you think I'm an academic, but maybe you've heard of Adam Smith, a great Scottish guy. And he wrote 2 books. So, do you know, heard of The Wealth of Nations? So the idea in the 90s, and the ideas which have been kept in front of many of our friends in Eastern Europe, is that the capitalist system is efficient. Economists say it's Pareto efficient, after the famous economist Wilfredo Pareto. It's impossible to have another arrangement of affairs which will lead without making somebody else worse off. That's what it means, efficiency. Now the point is, it may, even if I say it's not efficient because of the problems of the climate, but even if it was efficient, it's never going to be just. It's not going to be a just society. So what we've seen in America, in the UK, and you've described it very well in Hungary, but I've seen it in the Czech Republic, when they started nationalizing all their industries. Some people have become very, 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 very rich, and other people stayed very, very, very poor. So, although economists are good on saying what's efficient, they have no business saying what's just or not just. So at this point I switch from an economist to a social democrat, or so I think a capitalist may have a very ugly face. So I'm in favor of something called social capitalism. Now, well, all of you know that or moral capitalism, that's an oxymoron. It's a bit like a chaste prostitute. You don't get those. So it is, but it is the challenge in which we're, what politicians, what many of you youngsters will be facing in the coming years. How can you give capitalism? So that's the second book of Adam Smith, which is the theory of moral sentiments. And then really, there is no, if you just leave capitalism to itself, you unleash capitalism, you may get a quite shitty society. You will get pollution being dumped, you will get slavery is efficient. There's nothing wrong with slavery from an economic point of view. People have got a Nobel Prize for it. The most famous economic historian, American guy, Douglas North, got his Nobel Prize for that. And, but is it just, or is it something, is it moral, is it something we want to do? So you always have to have these two sides of the medal. And I think in the 90s, which is what I would call, it's the me era, was all the young people were trained. It's me. It's Adam Smith Mark I. If we are all purely egocentric, we all go for our own goals, then that's the best for economic society. You must have heard that parable many, many times, because that's what's been told. Jeff Sachs went to Poland to say that. Many economists have said that. And gradually we realize, remember Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Values like empathy, sincerity, trust, they don't come automatic. Trust is an expression, comes by foot and goes by horse. Another expression is due to Oliver Wendell Holmes. Don't put your trust in money, but put your money in trust. So really what we've seen about this whole financial system is that there's been a systematic build-up of kind of, due to greed, of kind of bad risks. So if we look at that a lot of it, then you say, why has it not been regulated? Well, the problem is regulation is there and it's in place. But take Europe. Europe was supposed to be this great continent where everybody's got their act together. Oh, rubbish. My friend Gijs de Vries was a Dutch boy and man. I should say boy. He's younger than me, but he was the anti-terrorism czar of Europe, and he resigned because basically he couldn't get the intelligence authorities of Europe to exchange information. Now we have a parliamentary inquiry in the Netherlands, and our president of our central bank and our minister of finance have just been questioned. It was Friday and Thursday. Turned out that with the iSafe debacle, which is again the same principle, greed, get a slightly 0.5% more interest rate, put it there, whereas everybody forgot that Iceland was just operating like a huge hedge fund. It was just a hedge fund, just like the UK. It was a giant hedge fund, nothing else. Not a normal nation, they were a hedge fund. What are hedge funds? You gear like hell. You know what gearing is? You borrow cheap like hell, and you invest as risky as possible, and you hope that you make a lot of profit. If you make profit, you cash and you run. If it goes bankrupt, you run as well, and you let the government clear up the mess. So the taxpayer clear up the mess. That's been capitalism so far. It's a disgrace, and young people should remember that's a type of capitalism we don't want ever again. There was an Irishman who won this story. I want to give a slightly bad press. His name, any Irish people in the room, or there's always an Irish person? No? Well, it's a pity. You get Irish people, they're always good fun. But there was a European commissioner called McCreevy. Have any of you heard of him? Yeah, and he was, I thought, well, of course, a nice man. He was Minister of Finance. I think he probably was a more conservative background. But he kept on, I had a debate. I said, you must have European supervision system. He said, no. The market will look after it. Now, the G20 forced the European Commission to do European supervision, but we don't have it. What turned out at the parliamentary inquiry, maybe you've heard of the Royal Bank of Scotland, ABN AMRO debacle, that our president of our central bank, the information which the Bank of England shouldn't give into Holland, they just didn't give it. They were being quiet about the fact that they just pumped £30 million in the bank, that the bank was almost kind of dead. As John Cleese would say in Monty Python, as dead as a parrot. Dead. You couldn't get a more dead than that. And people were not even exchanging information like that. Because each country, it's like in environmental policy, acts on their own when it comes to that, whereas we need to have if you can't even get European supervision together, how can you get it on a global scale? So that's the first lesson, and we've forgotten too much about that. So the European project has been a great success in terms of more competition for goods, market and services, free movement of goods, market and services. Been one currency, all fantastic, but it's been not so good on this financial regulation business. So that's what we really need to have. Then we also have, of course, you have to be a bit skeptical about it, that these regulators are a bit poor guys. So I've got this young boy I look after a bit. Well, he's a head taller than me. And he's just finished maths. He did it in Warwick when he was 20. So he's 21 now. And he's did a course in financial engineering. He can do math options. He can calculate them. You know, very boring, but he'll be a good investment. If you don't have a rich husband, he'll be all right. So, but then what he does, so it said, why don't you work? He got an offer. It's a bit difficult because they all want to work for J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs. Because then, before you're 26, you make £600,000-700,000 a year. No problem. I know many of my students have got that. So he said, shit, it's a bit problem. Now I've got an FSA. But you want to work for the FSA, you're considered a complete loser. Do you know what the FSA is? The Financial Services Authority, the regulator. But then they get at most £50,000 a year. I think it's a very decent salary. I said, what do you think a nurse earns in London? 25,000. What do you think a school teacher earns? 30,000. 50,000, you're a loser. But there's something wrong if people say that. And also there's something wrong that if all the losers and all the people who are not considered to be very smart go and work for the Financial Services Authority, how can you expect them to regulate all these sharp guys who are motivated by multi-million pound and dollar contracts? So, and the financial landscape changes that fast that it's almost impossible to keep up. There's an extra issue there, which is just, don't consider it too flippant what I say, because I actually mean it, but just for something to think about, maybe not to respond to, but you will probably, maybe you giggle, but it's not. I think the city is partially to do with all these young boys full of this, what do you have it down here? The testosterone, yeah. Testosterone, so they just want to kill. And you see them, they want to go and kill, and they do it. It's really the stuff, the testosterone you need on the rugby pitch. So maybe I need a bit more mature ladies in the city. So it's also the type of people who work in the city. You should wonder, is this really what we want? We always talk about equal representation in boardrooms. Maybe we should think about slightly different type of people running our pension funds, running our banks and things like that. So I think it already would help a lot if there were more women, and there was also people who just, when the testosterone dies out a bit or becomes a bit less prominent. But there's that element we should think about as well. So this is the whole problem. And then when you think, how does it hit? So my story is going to be mainly a story for developing countries. So I think the developing countries are really screwed. When I think of developing countries, I particularly think of the African continent. So when you look at it, we see that private capital dries up. Actually, in fact, a lot of capital is being repatriated from developing countries. Being also actually not just developing countries, also Middle and Eastern European countries. People who are investing like hell, it's all being taken back. People are dry. Nothing's happening. That's also an important reason, FDI drying up and things like that, why many of these countries are flat on the backside. Then for the developing countries, we see that since foreign aid is often tied to GDP, 0.7 or 0.8%, depending on the country, particularly in the Nordic European countries, that's falling as well. Then thirdly, we see, of course, there's less international world trade, goes flat on its bottom, so these countries have nothing to export to anymore. Furthermore, you get a lot of protectionist tendencies. So now people are coming out in some countries again, not too much exports from these poor countries to us. We need to protect our own jobs. All of these are particularly hurtful for developing countries. Finally, we have many poor people from developing countries working in our countries. In Berlin, of course, you have a large Turkish community. In Rotterdam, you have a big Cape Verdean community. These people are less able to send money back to their families and things like that. And we know that the return, the profitable return on remittances, this is what they're called, that's money much better spent than say, development aid, because they know their country's much better. So often that money leads to big investments. So that's all a reason why these developing countries are hit a lot. Now, I won't discuss by how much these countries are declining, because you gave some nice graphs for Hungary. Russia is declining like hell. It's true for that whole region. It's true for large parts of the world. Here you see capital being repatriated. Here you see foreign aid declining. Here you see another problem is, of course, that for these countries on the right you have this sharp fall in remittances. And on the left side, another problem is that because the whole world economy is on a lower pitch, is running at a slower pace, you find that commodity prices have gone down a bit. And for many developing countries, some of these developing countries, if you think of, say, not so developing countries like Algeria or Nigeria or Congo, sometimes 60, 70, 40, 50% of the national income depends on the sale of just one of these commodities. If commodity prices drop like that, they're screwed. So what I'm saying is that there is a large part of the world financial crisis. The costs fall in the poorest countries on our planet, and it's got nothing to do with them. It's got zero to do with them, and yet it falls on them. So that's a big issue. Just like it's got nothing to do for Hungary, incidentally, not all of it. Okay. So, well, we talked quite a bit about it, so I'll be short on this. We need to think more about global politics. We need to think about what are our... Some of you will want to work if you can't finance, or you can't get over kind of being a high-flying city banker in Manhattan or the City of London. Then the second best thing is that what most young people do is they say, well, could I not possibly get a job at the United Nations? Or could I not possibly get a job at the World Bank or at the IMF? And then, you know, they're tax-free and you also get a lot of money. But these institutions are perhaps rightly not so popular at the moment because they go into a lot of these developing countries and, you know, they get paid huge salaries, whacking big salaries. I mean, and, you know, I won't say it because otherwise more of you will want to work there. And yet they are not representative. So the main thing about Copenhagen, the main thing what we're realizing now is that once and for all, the theater of global political and economic negotiations has completely changed. Europe is, in a sense, a retiring continent of rentiers and almost irrelevant in terms of all the dynamics and growth that's happening in Asia. Of course, I over-exaggerate, and we like to think we're more important, but the truth of the matter is we've become less important. Many of the big issues will have to be solved by China, Chinese leaders and American leaders looking each other in the eyes, and increasingly also India. The sad thing is, what turns out if you read many political studies, is that Africa is more and more the forgotten continent and is actually not even on the negotiating table at all. Africa is not needed either for a good Kyoto, post-Copenhagen agreement. So, but it's really China and things like that. So so the idea that we had a, what is it, monopolar or whatever, that you had a hegemony of the United States, it's gone. Now we have a multiple polar world. Russia, the BRIC countries, you know what the BRIC countries are? Brazil, Russia, India and China, and the US then as well, maybe then Europe. But Europe can't even speak with one voice. So we don't even have who's the president? We got now 3 of them, I think. I don't know, we have Barroso, we have this lady from the English lady, and then we have this guy, the haiku the lovely guy from Belgium, and it's a good joke. Huh? And I actually like Van Rompuy, but he seems to be a very decent man. But the powers, and then you have all the political leaders of the EU. They should have one voice towards the others, but they don't because the EU is very divided. We have Italy and France are very statist, very centrist, very top-down. Scandinavia, the Netherlands, the UK are very more decentralized. That's a tradition. That's how it started in the Renaissance period, also how the Dutch Republic started, how the British, that's why the Dutch and the British are very similar. The same thing is true for Scandinavia. That's a huge rift within the European Communion. We have some people who lick the backside of the Americans when Bush was still in power, and others who don't. So we don't have a common Europe yet. And then if we did have, Barroso had the power of Van Rompuy, we still don't know which one. And they won't get much power because poor old Sarkozy is like a little dilapidated little plant which needs the water of public relationships every day. So we move from the first crisis, which is the financial crisis, which I think is partially a value crisis. It is the idea that this oxymoron of social capitalism. How can you make sure that the capitalism is not unbridled? It's not kind of that it's completely unleashed. So how can you? I think capitalism is obviously has done extremely many good things. For example, it's lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty in Asia, not yet in Africa. So there is an enormous power. So this second issue, the climate crisis, and we talked already about it, is really how can you harness the market to kind of solve one of the biggest missing markets problems in the world. And that's the fact that we all pollute, and yet we don't pay a price for it. So really, when you think a bit about it, there was a very nice lecture by the young man from Heidelberg, Timo Guschel, this morning. Some of you still remember. He was a good lecturer as well. And he talked, well, he will play an important role. His main thing was technology. He said, without a technology, we will never be able to do it. So that's the same thing, we're feeding the world. I mean, if you looked at the world since 1750, the population in the world has gone up about tenfold, and income per head has gone up tenfold as well. So we've got 100 times as much pressure on food that needs to be eaten or on pressure on the environment. And yet the planet is not disappearing yet. So a large part of it is that we're reducing emission intensities, which is actually what he showed us. Sometimes you do it stupid, like the solar power in Germany, but on the whole, we've managed to get it down a bit. But here you see the challenge. For the next 40 years, the global population, the world population, will go from about 6.5 billion people to about 9 billion people, a bit more than 9 billion people. This is already reckoning, so don't be misguided that when The Economist writes a few months ago that fertility rates are coming down quite a bit, they're already discounted in those estimates. So population is going to be enormous, huge pressure on the scarce resources and on the environmental capacity for operating on this planet. Now, no doubt about it, our planet will survive. You know, there's no problem, planets will survive, even if the temperature goes up 10, 20 degrees. But is it the way we do, as Susan George says, or the way the ecological environment, namely the biodiversity, well, that will survive. That's the question. But the planet will survive. It's going to be a bit hotter and it'll be a bit more unpleasant for us. That's the thing. And don't forget that they expect during the next 4 decades, in the business I will say a bit more about it, CO2 concentration will double. And don't forget that there is a Nobel Prize winner, Paul Crutzen, and he got his prize to show that the CO2 problem, to a large extent, it's man-made. Of course, there's ups and downs, like many people said. We've always had ice age and things like that, but now, don't forget this graph which you've seen is all flat, and the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years are going to boom, like that, CO2 emission. It's largely it's mostly, half of it is caused by industry and by vehicles. It's caused particularly by electricity plants, not when they use nuclear. I'm not necessarily in favor of nuclear, but it's particularly by coal-using plants, particularly brown coal-using plants. They're being built like hell all over the world, particularly in China, but also in Europe still. And it's caused a lot by eruptions from the mouth and from the backside from animals. That's then not CO2, but it's CH4. Do all of you know what the greenhouse problem is? Do you all know what it is? Some of you are not German, so Germans sleep naked, I believe, no duvet cover, but most people have a duvet cover, don't they? So you sleep underneath it, and the idea is a duvet cover keeps you warm, doesn't it? Because you're underneath there, and then your body gets warmth, but it can't get out. So after a while, it's quite hot underneath there, isn't it? I mean, pleasantly hot. That's really the CO2 layers. You get all these gases around the Earth, and they can't get out. They get trapped. So that's why it gets hot. So if you put more gases and they get trapped, and the layer becomes thicker, then the heat can't get out, and it gets hotter and hotter. That's how it works. Just for those of you, all of you know, but I thought it's useful to say. Yeah, well, it's important. So what are the risks of global warming? Normally I can speak for hours, but I will keep it as short as possible. We have rising sea levels. It can go very quickly. There was the lovely story of our Danish colleague, the very, I thought he did it very well actually, the MEP. I've forgotten his name, but and he gave this view on the melting glaciers. Just one of them. But so that's, and then a lot of these things are what we call tipping points. So I won't do it here. Normally I've done it once before, but then I got told off. So basically we have a happy economy is going. And then suddenly it fucks up the table. And then boom. That's what happens with the climate. So you have these non-linear effects. So things are not linear. Suddenly you can tip off the table, and then you get a catastrophe. So he mentioned a few examples. I'll add another one. I used to live in Brighton, and I loved it. And that was almost a bit what they had palm trees in the south of England. And the reason is, because ridiculous, because it should be bloody cold up there. And the reason they had palm trees is that they had a moderate climate, a temperate climate. It was because of the Gulf Stream. Now the Gulf Stream can easily go into reverse, and then whole populations will change. So that's something, a non-linearity, which can suddenly change. Another thing is, if things start melting, then the sea bottom may start, I can't call it anything else than farting, breaking wind. Yeah? So they release CH4. And CH4 is also one of these bars which gives you this duvet cover around the world and makes the planet hotter. So if you don't know anything about that, so if that suddenly goes into overdrive, then suddenly things can go very non-linear, and then it doesn't go like boom, 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 like the temperature, it goes boom, like that. And that's what people are afraid of. And that people are scared. So climate change is a bit like the financial crisis, one where we have extreme risks, which you're trying to avoid. So the issue is not risk aversion, the issue is precaution. So if I'm walking along a cliff path, and I know that there is an extreme risk that if I just put one foot outside, then I'll be down and I'll be dead as a parrot, I keep well away from it. I take huge safety margins, because I don't even want to take a small risk that I fall down it. Whereas if it's small risk, I can afford to be risk averse. No, be prudent. We have precaution, and that's all what the Stern report. Nick Stern, the guy who was now at LSE, Lord Stern, that is actually not Sir Stern, that he's arguing for the precautionary principle. Most politicians, for them, it's an automatic reflex, and it's something we should be aware of. But that's really what it is. Another thing I want to mention is, I said that all these destruction of natural habitats, I was on the UNESCO committee for many years, and then you have to not just do the monuments like the Cathedral of Cologne, but also all the natural habitats. So the Great Barrier Reef, some of you have heard of it, haven't you? It's completely screwed. It's dying. It's almost all completely dead due to the acidification of the oceans. Galapagos Islands. These are not, Galapagos Islands is a different thing. It's partially going bad because of the climate. That's also due to infringement of tourism. The Great Barrier Reef is largely a climate problem. So you see a lot of these climate have an effect on that. Another thing they have is that you're going to have massive shortages of water. You think we have a very watery planet, but the water we can actually drink is an extremely small percentage. Now, I just came from Dubai and talked with those sheikhs and things like that. For them, it's not really a problem. They're so, well, not Dubai, but they can get money from Qatar. They're so stinkingly rich, they can actually get the salt out of the seawater and get fresh water. For most countries, and for most citizens on this earth, that's just not an option. It's just too bloody expensive. So the water is going to be a big problem. And then somebody said it already, and I said, oh, it was me actually. So what you're going to get is that you're going to get all these wars, because climate change will make the fights about natural resources bigger, and you're going to get more wars, and these are real costs. Most of these costs fall on developing countries, and that's very bad. So climate change, it's caused by the rich countries. Most of the burden falls on the poor countries. So it's got a global equity aspect, and secondly, it's got a huge intertemporal aspect, a time aspect. If you wait too long, it'll be too expensive and be much further away from home. So there's got an urgency issue. Not urgency because you necessarily get a catastrophe, but if you wait too long, the costs go up very quickly. So here to show you some numbers, otherwise you think I'm just joking. This is the latest World Bank report. So it's not such a suspicious organization. They actually do quite good research. So here they see poor countries, middle countries, and rich countries. And then you see that the footprints, the emissions per capita, are way higher in high-income countries. Of course, they would argue, yeah, but emissions per unit of national income are actually quite good in the high-income countries. It's true, but of course the big issue is if America deals with China, you have to make sure that they got 1.3 billion people. So that has to be part of the political negotiation equation. It has not been kind of faced in Copenhagen either. Then, if you look here, it's also historically, it is the rich countries that have contributed most to the CO2 problem. So these are the cumulative CO2 emissions since 1850. And you can see that, well, actually, all I want to say there, that it's mostly been caused by the rich countries as well, historically as well. So they're polluting much more at the moment, and they have polluted much more in the past. So it's our fault that the world is going that direction. I'm putting it this way because there is this issue to do with it. Now, to give you what kind of things will happen, if you look at this agricultural yields, what will happen to this climate change in around 2050 if you carry on with agricultural practices and the crops you've got at the moment? Then if you look at the red stuff, Australia, almost all of Africa, most of Latin America, these are agricultural returns. So if you don't do anything, agricultural returns will drop by about 50%, half. So there's going to be huge food shortages, unless we have a technological fix with GM and things like that. But GM is very difficult in Africa because plots of land in Africa are already very small. So the green revolution we've had in China or in Asia is going to be more difficult in Africa because the plots are too small. It's not going to be possible to roll out, unless, like large parts of Ethiopia, are bought by foreign multinationals for their own profitable gains, which is what's happening as well. But that doesn't help those people. It's an excellent part of very efficient from the global capitalist system, but maybe not very just. It's maybe not something. Not everything what the capitalist system goes for is really something you want. So there's that. Then, so the climate change and war. I already mentioned these studies in these Science and Nature. So it gives you an extra dimension to the Malthusian population dynamics and the Darwinian survival of the fittest. But effectively what you get is a lot of evidence, more and more evidence, that as climate goes up, this is a bit academic, there's detailed studies where they've got thousands and thousands of conflicts over the last couple of 100 years, and they're directly related to climate change and all the other variables which could possibly affect conflict. Climate change has a huge effect on conflict for all the... So basically our gut reaction is correct, that's what I'm trying to say. So it's been backed up with detailed studies. Then if you look here, one of the reasons why it's difficult to have debates, well, you get people like Bjorn Lomborg or you get other politicians that, wait a bit and let's wait till we see. That's what people are saying. Also with this international panel, which have made some disastrous mistakes, maybe the chairman should be fired or whatever, but on the whole it's a very good panel. And they're collecting lots of evidence from lots of different groups. But the main message is that these things are hugely have long-run consequences. So, for example, these are the climate change effects. And then you see when you have annual CO2 emissions, how long it takes, 100 years to 1,000 years, for the effects on the environment to materialize. So these are we're talking also in the Stern report, has a perspective of 100 years. 100 years is very long. There's not something like there was one guy, this guy who said, most politicians say, or businessmen say, look, I'm not hired to look at changes beyond 5 or beyond 10 years. This is 100 years. So many of these damages we see, they can happen quickly, but one of the biggest damages happen 100 years on from now. So now, looking at then what needs to be done. Business as usual. That's what will happen, that's what the planet is going towards. And this is the 2-degree trajectory. So that's if you want to limit, remember what our Danish friend said, if you want to limit emissions so that the temperature rise is limited to maximum plus 2 degrees, he said he'd rather have plus 1.5 degree. Well, then you would have to be somewhere like that. These are all the policies that are necessary to get that. So you need, the biggest one, this is demand reduction. So to make the CO2 tax, the cost of CO2, about 3 or 4 times as high as it is at the moment in Europe. 3 or 4 times as high. Secondly, we have to do much more on renewables.
hydro, solar, wind, bioenergy. Nuclear is part of the equation as well. That's the little yellow bit. Fossil, forestings, other greenhouse gases, and you have to switch from coal to gas. The sequestration is also part of the equation. So don't be deluded when people come to you and say, we could solve it with all nuclear, or we could solve it if we just have a carbon tank. You probably need the whole scala of things. And furthermore, if you take the whole scala of instruments, it's also more efficient. I think it was, again, our friend from Timo Gussel, the professor from Heidelberg, who said we need lots of leaky buckets rather than one big fix, one holy grail. So these are these lots of leaky buckets. And if you do it all in one bucket, they get rapidly much too expensive. So it's best to use a bit of everything. If you've never studied economics, most of an economics, the adagium you learn, if in doubt, smooth it out. So this is really if in doubt, smooth. It's that principle. So why should we act now? People say, well, that's not, people say it's uncertain. You know, this whole things can go up to 5 degrees, things may only go up to 1 degree. And then many people say, well, we don't know, let's stick our head in the ground. That's what most politicians, there's a lot of politicians say, well, let's wait until we know. But we will never know. This is an area where you have to make decisions under uncertainty. Businessmen know this very well. In business, you always have to make decisions under uncertainty. So really what's going on here is, it may go by 1 degree, but some people say it may go by 6 degrees. So it's tough to get political support. So the whole bailout of all the financial banks cost about 5% of GDP, whereas this package, the Stern report says 0.5%, my figures and most people says it's actually need about 1%, but it's still a modest amount compared with all the bailout of all the banks cost. So I think the climate change fix is going to be expensive, but not as expensive, it's 5 times cheaper than the bailout of the banks. Good deal, I say, so go for it. But you need this credible carbon tax. And then, furthermore, a lot can be done by stopping stupid policies. The most stupid policy that Obama could stop immediately is to stop subsidizing bioethanol. Whole America is now full of bioethanol plants, and they're very extremely bad for the environment. You could just stop the subsidies. It's bloody good. It stops immediately, and you get there's no problem. So that's particularly the corn ethanol subsidies. Then the size of the carbon challenge is a bit to give you. So what Obama has, if you look at the United States, to get greenhouse gases 14% below the 2005 level by 2020 requires 1 gigaton. To get at the 83% reduction by 2050, you need 7 gigaton reductions. So I just thought, what is a gigaton reduction? How could you possibly get it? So you do some back on the envelope calculations or on the back of a cigar box. So for example, you take 1 gigaton reduction requires 320 zero emission fire-powered plants instead of coal-powered plants. So where you switch from coal power to fire power, 500. On top of that, you need 130,000 wind turbines. You need to take the size of Iowa, 5.4 times the size of Iowa, and you make it all for biomass production. You take the state of Washington, where my dear sister lives. You take 2.5 times the state of Washington, maybe Washington, Oregon, and a part of California. And you plant it all full of new forests. You need all these policies to just get 1 gigaton reduction. America needs 7 gigaton reductions. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to solve this problem. This is what I'm trying to say, that even for America, a lot of is required. Imagine what's required for China. So then you see that most of the emissions in the future will come from China and from India. So they are part of the equation. And the problem is really coal, to a large extent, not oil or gas, because oil and gas are running out. Don't forget that also there are some countries on the table who are very rich. And also, I talked about corn ethanol, so I take Canada, for example. They have these tar sands. And out of tar sands, it's quite expensive, but you can extract oil rather than pumping. But to extract oil gives enormous amount of CO2 emissions. So Canada is one of the dirtiest countries But they shouldn't really be a dirty country, but it's just because these bloody tar sands. So you really have to stop the economic interest, the unbridled capitalism, to make them think quite clearly, is that really what we want? So that's to show that coal. So oil and gas is with us for another 20 years. Coal is then with us for another 350 years. So really, above the line is what's already in the atmosphere from burning coal and gas. Below the line is what's still under the ground and can be burned and will then lead to CO2 emissions. So this is all this lot. Is that the future potential CO2 emissions if we burn all the remaining oil or gas, all the remaining coal. So you see that this bottom orange thing on the coal, that's all what's still in store for us if we burn all the coal that we've got in the world. So that's what all the challenge is for. To find technologies, to find alternatives, to find backstops, so that we can keep more oil and gas in the ground. In Holland, we've got loads of coal. We leave it in the ground. So maybe we should even subsidize people to not use oil or gas. There was in Copenhagen a proposal of Ecuador to pay them not to deforest, not to cut down the Amazon forest. I thought it was great. I thought we should have gone immediately for it. I say, okay, we pay you, we buy your Amazon forest, you stop cutting it down, and that's good for the emissions, and it's good for the biodiversity, and it's good for Ecuador poverty relievement. And it doesn't cost us that much money. It was not that much. It was it was a lot cheaper than rescuing one bank. And we couldn't even get our bloody act together. And really, it would have been such great if they just did it for one or two countries like that, to set an example, and then they all would come and knock on the door, hey, I've got a project. And that would be very good. And now deforestation, which is also a large part of the greenhouse problem, is going on at an alarming rate. And don't forget, it's not, so I come from the Netherlands. So one of the strongest Anglo-Dutch companies is a company called Unilever. Have you heard of it, Unilever? That does, everything you do uses linol, I think it's called in English, isn't it? This oil, rape oil or whatever it is. It's in your shampoo, it's in your margarine, it's in everything. But they knock down the forest to get it and to plant down. So there is that issue there as well. So I'm a cyclist. So I was when I was your age. When I was 18, I had a Jaguar. Then I had a Mercedes, I even had a Bentley, and then my best car was a real testosterone car, was an Alfa Spider. So I didn't even have to do anything. You just open the door and the girls would come in. I mean, it was a small sacrifice to make for all the immaterial benefits. But then as you go older, then I got a Hyundai Atos, and then I got a Fiat Cinquecento, and now I've got no car at all, and it makes me happy. I cycle everywhere. I eat 3-4 cakes a day, and I stay a little bit okay. But the point is, these SUVs. Do you know these cars? They look like tractors. They're these huge. What do you call? Is it SUVs? You call them? Yeah. If you just got rid of them, just in the U.S. alone, by just getting these cars, you will get enough to offset the emission generated in providing electricity to 1.6 billion more people. That's a stunning statistic. If only these people would go and use a Fiat Cinquecento, or for heaven's sake, the bicycle. How easy it is to do it. Another example. I like meat sometimes, but if you just all stop eating meat once a week, or maybe we don't all have to become complete vegetarians, but say just once a week or twice a week, that has more effect than getting rid of all traffic. That has a huge effect, because the meat thing not only deprives poor people from their food, because actually you get a pig or a cow, they eat the food, and then they get fat, and then they shit it out, and then you have to put more food and they shit it out, and then you get meat. It's a meat factory, isn't it? So it's much better just to eat the food yourself rather than let the pig eat it. It's actually a lot more intelligent response. That's called being a vegetarian. Now, we don't have to be all complete vegetarianism, but a bit more of it would not do so harm. It's actually also good for our diet. Some of you, if you want to have a medical thing, don't eat meat anyway in the evenings. Eat it at lunchtime if you have to eat it. So we've spoken already a bit about that, the global problem. The probable problem is one of carbon leakage. So when you look at it, there's a carbon leakage that if we put a lot of CO2 taxes on it in Europe, that's what everybody was worried about. We had it in the panel. Then, okay, I make carbon prices more expensive, and some of the carbon price is shifted onto producers of oil and gas. So they get lower prices. So really that's a generous transfer to all those people who are not part of the Kyoto Protocol. So the green paradox is that then they will start to consume more, and then effectively the whole policy is counterproductive. That's what's called the green paradox. On top of it's completely ineffective unless we have a truly global deal. And people have done many game theoretic calculations for that, particularly Professor Calacararo from Venice. And you need at least China and India in it. Africa is not important to get a sensible policies. If you're not doing it, the logic of the green paradox will render it completely ineffective. There's also a problem of pollution flight. So you get a lot of foreign direct investment, that a lot of the dirty FDI, all our dirty factories we're no longer allowed to have in Europe or in America. Well, we tell you what, we just put them in China, we put them in Africa. But Africa is now better because nobody asks many questions there. And then we can get rid of all the normal environmental regulations. So that helps. That doesn't help very much either. Now, I want to give you one thing, because I think I have to not talk too long, but I can talk quite a bit more, but I want to give you one little thought experiment. It's to do with Hans Werner Sinn, was been mentioned before. The optimal thing is to have a sharply rising CO2 tax. From about so now it's the CO2 tax is here, triple it, and then it should grow roughly at the rate of interest, about 4% per year. That's what economists would say. I won't talk about it. Well, I could explain it to you, but that's really what it is. Does anybody want to know why that is? Okay, so think about it. At what rate of increase should the price of oil go? If you're a real good business, you look like a good business guy. What do you think? You should be indifferent between the oil under the ground and the oil above the ground. What's the return if you take the oil out of the ground and you put it on the bank? Is equal to the rate of interest. What's the rate of return you get on oil when you keep it under the ground? You say yes, but what is the answer? What? Anybody? And one. 10%. Yeah. What is this 10%? The return. I mean, you pay like 10% more. What's the return? You don't touch it. You leave it underground. What? How much is it? The rate of interest. No. What did you say? The rate of inflation. Yeah. Well, almost. It is the capital gains. How much is it worth more after 1 year? So the rate of increase in oil prices is the return if you keep it under the ground, roughly speaking, and if you take it out of the ground, the return is this world rate of interest. If you arbitrage away, I'm already sounding a bit like this young little semi-son I have, these mathematicians, then the rate of return, increase in price of oil should equal the rate of interest. And that same logic applies for your optimal carbon tax. So that's why carbon taxes are never flat. They go up 3 times, and then they have to go rising forever at a certain rate of interest. It's slightly modified in there, but it's roughly, it's what they call a CO2 tax ramp. Now, people who will hate it, that's a very good point, is that OPEC, oil-producing countries, gas-producing countries like Qatar and Russia, they will see that it's stealing from them. Because really you're taxing their resources. And their resources are effectively inelastically supplied. So it's really you're screwing them up. So there is a geopolitical consideration there, which is very well put. I haven't not got time to discuss it, but that's an important aspect. Still, I think it needs to be done. But whatever. But that's the logic of the Stern report. So let's not have an answer to your complicated question, but let's have that for something to think about when we stay awake at night and worry about these things. So that's an important thing. But then most people say we can't do it. Maybe because of your reason, or because you're scared stiff of the electorate, that you're going to be, look, I'm a politician. I'm going to triple the tax, and I'm going to also increase it like that for the rest after. It's a little bit what they call political harakiri. Huh? So but imagine, so many people say that's not feasible. So then what people do like hell, what do people do then? They say, well, let's subsidize these alternatives. So let's subsidize to ridiculous amounts solar. Remember that what Timo, was it Timo who said it, that the price is about 30 in the market, 15 in the market, and then was it about 2,000 he said, or 20, it's 1,000 times more. It's not one order of magnitude, hundreds of order of magnitude more to subsidize solar that much. Now, many people, economists, warn against this second best policy, that it may actually take you further away from home, not only because it's expensive, but basically what will happen is, if I'm an oil producer, I will start pumping oil more quickly. If I see that these backstops are becoming more and more cheaper and being subsidized like hell, I think, fuck, they are, like you said, I will pump it up. I won't say, I will say, I will say, oh, golly, and then I will pump up like hell, like quickly, before it becomes completely valueless. But by pumping up oil and gas much more quickly than I would have done otherwise, I emit a lot of CO2 and I make global warming problem much more complicated. So there's both a global reason why CO2 tax may be counterproductive, and there's an intertemporal, rational, speculative reason why a CO2 tax may be very counterproductive. And there's, of course, as you say, there is the whole geopolitical question. So these are tough dilemmas. And eventually, almost all policies boil down to how can we make it attractive for people not to cut down rainforests, to keep coal under the ground rather than above the ground, and how can we keep the oil and gas underground and provide good alternatives. But by subsidizing these good alternatives, you may counterintuitively and counterparadoxically actually make them pump up these resources more quickly, worsening the environmental problem. Now, a lot has been said about the European trading system. It's not that wonderful as people make it out to be. It is, of course, wonderful because it's the only thing around. So 3 cheers for Europe. And I'm a committed European, so I think it's great. But let's try to be a little bit less excited, because at the end of the day, EU carbon trading covers only 40%, and they made huge mistakes of grandfathering. Do you know what grandfathering is? So you get all the biggest bastards who have been kind of being the dirtiest, the filthiest, the polluters one. You say, well, I'm sorry, we have to go and to put those taxes on, and you have to buy these permits and things like that. So we give you all the permits for almost the pollution you've done in the past. Got it anything to do with equity? No, that's got everything to do with the sirens of very strong lobby groups and politicians doing the wrong thing. So the biggest mistake that's been made with the European trading scheme is that the richest, the most dirtiest, the most polluting, the baddest boys of the class have been given huge windfall profits. That's really what they should have done. They said, here are the permits, put them all in one big conference hall, and say we're going to auction it off. And they did not have the guts to do it. And that's because in politics you have to be, all the left wing and the people like that, the Christian Democrats may have wanted it. You have the right wing, the more conservative or the more pro-industry political parties. And that's the ugly compromise we had in Europe. It was better than nothing, but it was an ugly compromise. So that's something what we have to learn. Now the neo-super-Kyoto, or the post-Copenhagen thing, is going to be EU covering only 40%. What I get it from my Danish friend, it might actually even be less. But anyway, it covers only a small part of it. And if you're going to extend it to the whole world, who's going to police it? Who's going to regulate it? Because what is it? So I go to a Chinese firm or a village or city and I say, look, I buy the rights for you to pollute, and then we clean up your rubbish. So you have less CO2 emissions, and then that saves me some CO2 rights. That's what will happen. But then there's going to be a huge amount of corruption. We've had 3 or 4 PhDs written on corruption, on deforestation, and also on these green miles. You know, you have green miles in the air. That's also an oxymoron. And then you plant more trees. A lot of the time that doesn't happen. There's a lot of corruption. This will happen here as well. As soon as we roll it out across the whole world, people will say, give us the money and we will reduce CO2. But the question is, will it really happen? And are we going to check it? Are we going to monitor it? It's going to be problematic. So there's a lot of stuff still there. In theory, it's good. In practice, I predict a lot of bad press in the future when things turned out to be not as glorious as we hoped. So these are the tipping points I talked about. We talked many about, so I can be quick on that. Just some names. The Indian monsoon, big lead to chaotic multi-instability. The greening of the Sahara. You may get the melting of the Greenland ice sheet that was talked by our Danish friend, Atlantic deep water formation, the boreal forest dieback. These are some of the main things. Changes in the Antarctic bottom water formation, a lot of the things we know, these are what they call tipping points. That's what these scientists call it. So a lot of the things that we know even less about. But these are possible catastrophes which will happen. And that's why we have to act. So this is the core of the Stern Review. This is a technical analysis, which I won't bore you with, because it's the end of the day. It's quite complicated, so I won't do that. And there's also the Weizmann critique. It's, well, basically what it's about let me do it for once, because not the technique, but just the ethical dilemma. Most people who are against the Stern Review, you know what the Stern Review does? The Stern Review says take a very low discount rate. What do you think a social planner or a benevolent dictator, a government? You sound very, very decent man. So you say, we give you the right to control the world. What kind of discount? How should he weigh future generations versus current generations? It's a huge ethical dilemma. Many moral philosophers have talked about. Now, what most people do, and also most people do, well, we should just take the rate of return to the market. But that's not right. I mean, it's 100 years from now. So really, Stern says we should really, Frank Ramsey this was the mathematician who was also a good economist, brilliant man, died at the age of 24 via the kick of a horse, a Cambridge mathematician. Fantastic guy. And he said it should be zero discounting. But really what you're saying, normally say, well, each generation, each year is about 4% or 3% less. You can't, that may be reflected in shares and share prices. We can unscramble it. That's a technical bit that I won't do with you. But believe me, I can do that. But then, is that ethical? So Nick's thing has been mostly to say, look, I actually think it's not ethical to discount future generation. If you take the force of discounting is such that if you discount only a little bit, then 100 years' time, that any potential gains from climate change policy will be worth nothing today. So you're never going to do climate change policy. So almost the whole debate on the Stern Review and on climate change policy is between those who say you should discount and those who say you should not discount and we should care about our children. So I'll leave you. That's a bit technical. So the third bit, how many more minutes have I got? 2 minutes? It's done. It's finished? Okay, I will do a closing statement. So I hope I've made clear that there is a financial crisis and a climate crisis. Both financial crisis and climate crisis are crises which are man-made, mostly man-made in the richer parts of the globe on our planet, where most of the costs fall on the poorest parts of our planet. So I think that the ugly faces of capitalism should be given a more friendly face, and I think that's a political challenge, irrespective of whether you're right-wing, left-wing, or whatever. It's a generational issue, and it's a global equity issue. Now, I had a third and a fourth crisis, which I will just mention briefly, don't worry, which I could talk, actually, the natural resources is my field. I could talk on that for hours, but I won't. But the thing is, our minerals, bauxite, silver, gold, the stuff which is in our mobile telephones, what do you call it again? Sorry? Quartz, yeah. So what we see in the Congo, this is the only place where you can find that stuff, is that people, these Africans, are knocking each other's head in. So we say, they're a bit uncivilized, these Africans, if they're in the business. But I mean, if we were completely poor, and we could not live, and we die because we don't have good sanitary conditions, we don't have good water conditions, and our assets are being stolen by Western multinationals, and some of these multinationals fund armies, literally fund armies, to protect access to the natural resources, to tungsten, this stuff which in that oil and gas and whatever, including Shell. And other multinationals finance other ethnic fractions. Should we be that surprised that they start knocking each other's heads in, chopping others' heads off and things like that? Can we be so sure that we were in such a situation that we will be so high-handed and say, no, I'm going to have a quiet death? Would you not like, is it the case in Haiti now, would some of us maybe, they would start robbing the streets and doing whatever is necessary to survive, even if it means killing your own brothers. But that's what's going on. So a large part of this scramble for natural resources, that's what it's called, a race for natural resources, that they're finite. China needs an enormous amount, India needs a lot of amount. So what's happening is China is buying up left, right, and center all these things all over Africa. They don't pay money. What they do, China, they're clever, is they say, we build you a bridge, or we build you an airport, or we build you a town, or we build you a road. No ethical questions asked. So we come, my Dutch government or my English government, I'm half Dutch, half English, and we say, we give you some development aid, but you must do that, you must do that, all these little finger, which really gets up China's nose as well, quite rightly so, because we always know better. We have the moral right, because we don't. And then we tell them, you must do that, and must do that, and then China comes in and they just do the job, and they go to the most fragile states. So read Paul Collier's books, either Bottom Billion or his subsequent book on wars in Africa. And it's really then the question is, maybe we should rethink the way we do development aid. And maybe we should be in countries for 10, 20 years to give alternative work for all these rebels. Because these are also full of young and testosterone. And they're very easy prey for warlords. If they have got no alternative, no work, nothing else to do, bleak, 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 you will join an army, even when you're 16, 17. If you don't join an army, you may be screwed as well, because you may have your head chopped off. So don't ever blame these people. Also when they're fighting just to get access to water. And it's everywhere. It's not just Darfur, even the Gaza Strip. But it's particularly true. And we see it because the one country where it doesn't happen in Africa is a country called Botswana. And Botswana is a country which is very homogeneous. If you compare it with Nigeria, if you don't fight each other, you'll find a lot of corruption. So the biggest example is Nigeria, which is very ethnically diverse, has been flat. For the last 30, 40 years, income distribution has gone up completely. The rich own everything, the poor own nothing. Income per capita hasn't grown at all, whereas Botswana has grown about by 8% per year. So really a large part of this global capitalism, putting a social face to global capitalism, will also involve a solution on what to do with scarce resources. Final point, as one sentence, is the same thing is true for the food crisis. Now food prices are a bit low, but we know that when we project, if you look at the FAO reports, it is the organization in Rome, people expect food prices to go up and up and up. We need a green revolution to solve the problems in Africa, and yet we know that that's going to be more and more complicated. I will cut short because I think I see you that you'll be grateful if I stop. So thank you very much for your attention.